Hello everyone, today we talk about the connection between war and finance in early modern Europe. We already made multiple videos about the costs of war, morally, socially, even how culture was affected in many ways by the great hardships that war poses, not just from a strictly military but also organizational point of view. Today we observe all that world of middlemen and say greater and smaller institutions that rendered the funding of the ever larger modern armies possible. Right? It's not a financiary history video strictly meant, but it's just like a sort of introduction to give an idea of how and why, war stimulated, of course, an important business, as always, that, however, should never be confused conspiratorially into thinking, well, you just make war because you want to, wasting all the resources possible, making just some specific, say, groups earning, even though say what war is on a regular basis is always a gamble, and so couldn't even be possible in the first place without the decisive moral majority of politics, the military, and society. I mean, if you don't have that, it means that either that doesn't correspond to the actual numerical majority of the people, is that these people are morally inferior and actually they're incapable of managing the military instrument as such, in order to have actually a political control. But of course, we live in a society mostly of lesser people from the fourth estate who think that going to school is something anywhere near to being an adult human being, which is a very complicated statement to have the boldness of making in the first place. But and which school, by the way, because that would be the interesting aspect of it all. But it's one of those topics in which, of course, historiography and literature and many other sort of aspects, in fact, our world got fascinated with, mostly because of the aforementioned conspiracy theories and all this stuff. But the historical reality is much more interesting, as always, of course, and also much more complicated, and in this sense, hidden, truly, for those who, of course, do not want to make even an effort of getting an actual education. But at this point, it's obvious for all the videos we've made, the connection of, let's say, of politics and warfare, not just through the Clausewitzian concept, of course, of war being just an instrument of politics with other means, but also because we have seen many times how, of course, the Clausewitzian triad in politics, war, and society is essentially reflective of all the various elements at the same time. The organization of early modern warfare and statehood is, of course, accelerated by first of all, a compaction of the political, territorial realities in late medieval Europe that we have just been talking about recently, which basically witnessed the conferment of power to individual, say, institutions that are, in the sense, more functional, rational, and efficient, right, in taking care of a type of work that is, in this sense, ever more costly because it is ever more qualitative. That's the ancien regime actually step further in this mechanism. The people's armies had failed in the later Middle Ages, especially with the great crisis of 14th century. What you have at the beginning of the modern age are essentially armies of proletarians that are firmly and soundly under the control of the great princes of Europe, right? That can, in fact, dispose of this large amount of men and simply commanding them with great efforts, economically speaking, but without too much of a risk, right, of upheaval, whatever, because that had, by large, and if the situation was such at this point, been reduced dramatically as a as a possibility in previous centuries. Not everywhere, as we were talking about yesterday. Some of the lesser developed areas of Europe still were difficult to centralize, and in fact remain more backwards, feudal in nature. If you look at the German peasants' revolt, for example, you observe that, of course, this could happen just in a particularly fragmented area of Europe, and in any case was put down by, traditionally and incredibly rigidly aristocratic system, just like the German one had basically always been since the early Middle Ages. And that really made no exception in this regard, if not chronologically speaking, because, certain systems arrived later on the foreground, right, of European warfare, and so there you have it. There is also a great increase, as you know, in the later Middle Ages in banking, let's say, system security and management. The great 14th century crisis had showed that essentially the risks of a system that didn't really have brakes, right? Any system to absorb the downsides, right, of that economically occur after enormous phases of expansion, and that in fact had brought also to a much greater capital control than before, right? Just like you have a control of the population, you have a control of wealth. The best example is Florence, right, which was the literally richest city in the globe in the first half of the 14th century, because there were also so many different groups that operated within it, and of course there were many other reasons why Florence really was, and you have in absolute terms at the time, in fact, the largest amount of wealth, and that you can recollect, right? Florence had really the same life quality. It has been, said like Antonine Rome, so the peak of the empire, but actually it's a comparison that I think exceeds too much in positivism, meaning how do you compare actually the life quality of 14th century Florence with one of the Antonine Rome? The idea being, however, that of course was a dramatically affluent system. Well, after the mid-14th century crisis, what you have is that many banks fail and others basically take them over. And politically, this is reflected in the 15th century by the rise of the Signory in what's still de facto republic, and with the Medici having been at that point the literally the richest bankers in absolute terms that had ever happened, but with Florence, after the crisis, like the entire Eurasian system not being as absolutely wealthy as it had been before. And this is how, in fact, that in moment of crisis, the systems react, right? Greater control, shrinking because of lack of resources, but in this sense also a qualitative capacity to manage your resources more effectively. By the way, late medieval Europe is being credited also for the development at an elite level, in fact, of a banking system that preserved dramatically capital, because the banks were essentially relying, time still of war, of invasions, etc., of the possibility of simply shifting capitals all in this various parts of Europe that how it had politically fragmented after at least the decline of universal authorities, and so saving, right, in a more rational and effective way the resources, right? It's again the consequence of a time of crisis, but still, right? So this goes in parallel with the development, as you know, ever more performing armies, increased collective training, the introduction of large artillery parks, and this cost an enormous lot. And this type of armies that were not really particularly bigger or even more punching necessarily to some degree than some that had existed in earlier times, but it depends which country we're talking about. In any case, the ones that had been most advanced before were also at this point. But as we've seen, because of the crisis, these are sort of heavier, right? And in a specific weight sense, right? Also from a logistical point of view, supplying system, etc. And naturally, those states that are able to compact more wealth through administration, through tax collection, and the effectiveness, this system are the most military powerful, right? So this change in the funding of armies was naturally very gradual. At the beginning, we could argue it was a purely financially mean, right? We have recently made a video about the establishment of semi-permanent companies in the history of Europe during the 15th century. These systems had actually already been there. Say companies in general had become de facto semi-permanent from quite a while, from the early 14th century, but now the armies were compacting essentially on that basis, or at least the backbone of the armies was starting to be about that. And naturally, these units must have a higher degree of professionalism. They have to be, in this sense, more disciplined, more reliable, but also better fed, better trained, and so provided the means that made them, in that sense, more performing. So less quantity, but higher quality. And that, of course, as you know, in proportion actually costs more, but it also can make you obtain more, depending on which is your target in this regard. You have a surpassing, in at least the most advanced parts in Europe, of forms of military service based on the feudal levy or the general call to arms. So when you look at these companies, the end of the Middle Ages, you realize that these units could have not been hired without the gold, for example, of the great merchant bankers of 15th century Italy, nor the Swiss or the Landsknechts without the intervention of the Fugger, of the Welser, or the financiers of Piacenza or Lyon. So these were all examples of, let's say, how still there is also a great degree of continuity with previous wealth. I made a video about the financial hegemony of Italians from the 11th to the 14th century. You know that the condottieri were fundamentally the product of a system that was actually tending towards a more centralistic capacity, hadn't the Italian states being still particularly gentrified and sort of also relatively small in terms of population, differently from other neighbors that were reaching a level of national unity through their monarchies. And so the warfare of these years is fascinating because it shows how even very qualitative systems could actually be surpassed by, in a sense, bigger ones, but that were so obviously with sort of less quality. I mean, if you look at even in today's times, I mean, if in absolute terms, I don't know, the U.S. military quality is not as high on average than, I don't know, the Belgian or the Canadian one, say. But it's obvious that Belgium or Canada do not have minimally the military capacities of the United States, and that can actually afford just that high level of quality because their strategical and operational tasks are sort of more reduced, also because they are backed by their American allies. So here it's a bit like the same. When you look at France and you realize the immensity of the system, you can't avoid to see, as we have observed, for example, in the video about the native French infantry of the Italian wars, that, of course, it's a fairly unbalanced system, right? There are things within that do not really work overall as they should, right? Also, in later times, France has this great hurry of putting her act together because it's an incredibly powerful system, but in this sense agitated by internal currents that make it difficult to keep it together, and as a consequence, its quality can sort of go down when you look at the individual units or whatever, but the capacity overall, and that, let's say, the overall strength, and at that point, the capacity of being able to manage that large amount, even through enormous efforts eventually pays off and creates ever more sort of concentrated force and capacity of supplying. It's in many ways always a matter of money, right? As the Feld Marshal Montecuccoli would respond to the emperor, like, there are three things that are needed in war, Your Majesty, that is money, money, and still more money, right? And so medieval, let's say, European armies at this point do not really differ enormously from one another. These early permanent companies, for example, and corps are sort of just numerically the minority, of course, of the broader forces were still fighting essentially in a medieval way. They would go on until fundamentally the second half of the 17th century, organizationally. But yes, the Swiss armies, right, for example, had the way they were very primitively put together. The 15th century Switzerland, I made a video about the history of the Swiss army. You know that Switzerland had literally nothing, right? Switzerland is today one of the most successful and richest countries in the entire world, and it began to be so still to this day without actually any resource, right? The Swiss Confederates lacked everything. They were technologically zero. They had no metals. They had literally nothing. They were just primitive mountaineers that, however, were capable of exploiting also the differences within the various cantons and saying, we've seen how, in that case, for example, the more developed Swiss cities, the ones that had a greater economic opening to the international market and so on, could provide with a better, first of all, with larger forces, but also had the dominating role, and they acted also suppliers for sort of the more backward cantons in the mountains, etc. And so this Swiss example is fascinating because in a way it actually corresponds to the one we've seen in Europe, just per se, in the market of mercenaries. Mercenaries normally come from the most depressed areas of Europe, as a matter of fact, and they come to fight in the most advanced, the ones that can pay the most. So there is definitely an internationalization of also money management, which had been one of the great deals of the Middle Ages, the fact that you start having banknotes, right? You don't have to transfer all the actual precious metal from a place to another. You can arrange this on a market that starts having its also its greater challenges, like in controlling, handling, and sort of predicting. But that makes resources move, right? The Fugger, as you know, went bankrupt at a point in order to pay the Habsburgs. The Bank of St. George of Genoa substituted them. You have the Welser, this other city, rich cities like in the case of Piacenza and Lyon, that continue with some traditions that had already had during the Middle Ages, and that contribute to the subsistence of some of the largest armies existing at the time. And this is, I think, particularly important. There are lots of implications here. Think about the large amounts of precious metals that the Spanish access in the New World, and how this eventually impacts how it was an advantage to some degree, but it was complicated even for them to just control the effects eventually on the broader market in a way that would end up even damaging part of the Spanish Empire at a point. But I promise I will make another video about this. There is a progress at different levels, technological one. There are new needs in the military field, such as many others, right? And again, mostly it's a problem of resources concentration, supplies of literally moving armies that are becoming ever heavier, where what it takes, especially in terms of firepower, starts becoming ever more demanding and precious, and sort of in great demand. And of course, mercantilism starts kicking in. There is constant necessity of having ever larger funds accessible easily. This was not particularly different conception from any other time. In medieval armies traveled with treasures with them because the troops that followed it basically knew that as long as there was some precious metal to be paid, they were still with a winning guy, right? At this point, you have role of the entrepreneurs changing from the past, mostly in its development, its articulation, in also its specialties, its fields, in the geographical extension. Where do you actually get these provisions? It's not much that there are more, just per se, but there are some resources that are concentrated in an area or another, and so you must have an access to that, so that there is not an imbalance in the ingredients that you need in order to make warfare work and combine arms effectively. Naturally, the financial one was not the only problem, right? There was a debate exactly about this time, the famous expression pecunia nervus belli, which is by Cicero in his Philippicae, and Machiavelli actually let's say criticizes that, because it says rightfully, like, it's not much about money after all, and it's even more, we should add as contemporaries, it's not about technology especially. That makes a lot, but warfare is primarily a matter of moral forces, and as such it should be dealt priorly. So you have, first of all, the question: where do you get the money? Right? And if you get the money, you can't get still other, say, troops to fight for you. It's full of mercenaries. Europe would remain with all this sort of roaming companies for a very long time, especially in the least developed parts that were sort of the pretty large amount of the same. That even in the most advanced armies, see the Spanish ones, there was a level of volunteer participation that at that point was seen as a honor more than a venial thing. But it's always about what the entrepreneurs of war, as the commanders were themselves, those who were subcontracted, in fact, the levying of the various units, and would try to make some money out of that at the expense of the quality. As you know, the story a bit of all early medieval warfare made lots of videos. The one about Guzman de Alfaraque, for example, is the Spanish rogue. It's quite fascinating. I have to re-upload that, but it's really telling about the general misery, right? Also the profit that you could get from war. As always, not that enormous, right? You can't, like, say, if somebody goes at war, there are ways to profit from that, but say it's politically, first of all, about the community that does that as a whole, what they expect to get from that, and only secondarily you have instrumentally, let's say, somebody trying to fund that and sort of trying to profit from that. But in that sense, those are not the guys who actually move the system just per se. You know how unpredictable actually the system is, especially when you get down to things like politics. And no, the system is not ruled by simply the guys who made the weapons, right? Those could be quite fine enterprises, but they will always have someone also abroad that would like to buy, etc. So that's just something that exists because there is a will to fight for any other reason. So the two things go in parallel, and you can't see a causal relation by saying, war is just made by the few, because the other poor martyrs to die. Those are just bunch of disgusting motherfuckers, scum of the earth, that are just parasitically living, most of it, especially at this point in history. They're some of the most diseased people in society, but that are perfectly supporting, of course, and entirely so, the political side, because the moment in which you're put a gun in your hand, you have the opportunity of using it at that point as you please. And instead, these systems are also sort of working by themselves, as always they do in civilization, because of course there is a will to go fight for that specific purpose, and it's not a matter of mental alienation or simple ignorance. It's literally that, also the reason why you want to go fighting and supporting that is also your own interest. And so definitely, again, the conspiratorial fourth estate, or the responsibilistic delusion that I personally treat as a mental illness, is exactly what eventually gets more of these people killed, as a matter of fact. So, because they don't know how to handle the military instrument. And in fact, in the history of civilization, this is not really a matter of personal opinion, fortunately. When you look at even, I don't know, clothes supply. I mean, I have a playlist that deals with historical uniforms, dress, clothing, depending on how you want to define that. Well, that's relevant enough. It's as we've seen, not a particularly, say, it's definitely not a decisive element, but it starts being useful. It starts being required in these centuries. It had always been there to some degree, but now it intensifies. There are lots of people working for that, right? You need people literally victualling the troops. You have lots of other items needed for war, even just for transportation, for things that are fundamentally civilian in nature, right? Always remember, logistics is not a branch of the art of war, aside from what people will want to act more mature than they are definitely would like to make you think. This is not to say that logistics does not influence war, but you can't screw up everything even perfectly with a fully supplied army, right? It's strategy that matters. Logistics in that sense sounds, if you exchange it for it, just as the usual deterministic, relativistic, materialistic nonsense that most adults fundamentally remain in their, in fact, not really adult existence. War, in a way, transforms at this point gradually into an industrial activity. It really paid a lot of people, right? A lot of people that were also poor in the production system. And that did create, within the sphere, elevated profits, which is kind of obvious. There's a war going on. You work producing weapons that you make money at that point, but you're not really the one that is going to push for that. And there's also to consider that, of course, wherever you have a profit, there is also a competition. So you would see, as always, a thick elite of sort of shrewd profiteers in often very close contact and in interest relations with members, of course, of the establishment. Also very high in the social hierarchy, and of course this was just to maintain the quickest channel open for actually funding the troops that at that time were in fact maintained by these individuals in the hierarchy, right? And also in here, right, the degree by which these men were willing, for example, to go out war, for example, was not that obvious, right? Very often they actually tried not to spend too much, also because their political and social success was connected with managing, in fact, to speculate on these troops, but not really going at war. Were, if they were to sort of squeeze of their resources, would have also performed very poorly. On the other hand, there were real, commanders, just adventurers, etc., that were able to get founded again in the sort of most even, contingential ways, let's put it in this way, and that were pushed by desire, ambition, vision, and that managed, right, to convince actually those who had the money to invest in them. This I discussed, for example, in the construction of the Tudor Navy in Elizabethan times, when new ideas, new insights had just been understood by individuals who had been out there, say in the Caribbean, fighting in conditions of extreme, even shortage, let's put it in this way, that had to win the favor of Elizabeth, in this sense also superseding and say substituting properly those older commanders that had ordered social interests and so on, but had also outdated idea and would have not in that sense made the right choice and so on. So the complexity of that alone debunks again the sense that these guys just wanted war because of their personal profit. There was already war just per se. These guys were just exploiting that and contributing to that at the same time. You can't quite see either one side or the other in that regard. Also in the so-called, say, relaxed France of the Regence, we are basically after the death of Louis XIV between 1715 1723, right before Louis XV could rise to the throne due to his minority. That the financier John Law could easily resume the old phrase, Kicker's phrase, pecunia nervus belli, war. The money is really the soul of war, right? And stating that in fact, in a war, victory, this again is a deterministic idea, but goes always, he said, to he who has more money, right? And this was obviously not. This is not the case. That's not the equation, really. That the more powerful you are, and the more you are likely to win a war. Not always you are, even in that case, and that may not entirely depend on money. Actually, we've seen it on many occasions in history. Say the Mongols were more powerful than, say, the Chinese. Yes, they took them over, but were they richer than them? No, right? And they could have failed. Just with Europe, instead they failed largely. So the question is, or they didn't even try. Okay, but also because they really couldn't in some ways. But this is not uniquely to do with money. Money is not making the thing alone, at least. And also these peoples, yes, they can be more or less rich, but they're, say, big within Europe, they are still at a similar level of development at the end of the day. So there was a lot at stake, also with the moral intent of it all, right? Why do you do anything? Why do you even need to fight a war, right? Politically, that can depend on so many aspects that if you don't understand really the mentality of tradition, you will end up saying things like, it's all money, man, it's all a scam, it's all the sense that we could live so well, instead there is always some bastard that has to fight a war for no reason. There are some bastards that start war for very stupid reasons and that also fail as clamorously, and that the things are closely intertwined. But the, say, war per se is just a political instrument. It's the fact of somebody dying in a war as opposed to dying because, I don't know, of cigarette smoking, or allowing that to be legal, or stopping to export dairy products just for market reason in a country or another. It's the same amount of dead people. Actually, some of them dying actually in a war in a much more voluntary and sort of sensible fashion, and also in a quicker way, in a way. But the point, in fact, being ridiculous just per se. But at the time, just considering that warfare was considered a sport for rich people to some degree, it was particularly important for the stability of the states now that, of course, were doing something more than sporting, to be, for example, captured in battle, right? It's not just about all the fantascents that were killed, with makeup and wigs in front of Mithraea, just without batting an eye, because, as we will see now, some videos I'm preparing, of course, we already addressed the topic recently. It's about the discipline that is enforced, also thanks to this economical viability and concentration, say, increase of collective training, of discipline, even the concept of the humanization of the soldier in a way. But what about a nobleman that is captured? What about a king that can risk? At this point, they're avoiding doing that, but there are some that are still very bold and expose themselves to that, and still a ransom costs a freaking lot. Right, so everything definitely has a cost. Economy is not just about money or the equivalent of it. It's really also moral in concretely. Everything has a price, also the non-material. And as we know, we're not fully rational, right? So that's also something you must always account. The homo economicus does not quite exist, as we know. Even if there is always a very sound coherence, that, however, the more you study historically speaking, the least actually it has to do with economics per se. That's, again, a materialistic superstition. It has to do with the reasons why wars are fought, which is, again, are much deeper and sort of spiritual in nature. So the ancient terror of war, its sacral element, was surely in modern Europe shattered by secularism, by modernism. There were, as we've seen, some especially of these third estaters, like most financiers. Well, okay, they were also from, at least they were intertwined, as we've seen, with the nobility, but of course it was the bourgeoisie increasing. Like, who were the guys who could provide greater money supplies, etc. Were the cities, were the great slave traders. We've seen it in like in medieval Europe. We were talking about it just yesterday. Why are cities so important in certain feudal contexts? Well, because the cities exist in the first place because they managed to accumulate in a greater surplus from the countryside in the first place, that are sustained with that. So there is an excess that can be invested by supporting logistically by the craftsmen, the guilds, those who have the technology, the means, the supplies, and so on. And this was always very important, and the state building in the early modern age is passing also through this, is passing through the co-opting of ever greater centers, for example, in the the balance of power within the same. And so there is the idea also that the bourgeoisie is injecting some values that are deterior compared to the one of the nobility, that were much more about the concept of honor, of actual, the imperial ideal, and the relation with God and so on. So that you have also, because these are the third estaters are the guys that also write the most, that really are very similar to the, at least up to a few generations ago, to what was really the standard of the if you want, the gentleman. Doesn't have to do necessarily with being a nobleman, as you know, but that, of course, thought a lot about money, just per se. This was prefiguring the final step into the fourth estate ideology. So the sense is that war, in a way, can just be reduced to on the basis of money, right? Of economical quantification, base of actual resources, material, in a way or another, or at least something that could be translated into that. It just was about the amount of money spent for it. This is a very wrong concept. Politically, strategically, morally, that's not really how the thing goes, right? You need an enormous amount of money to make war, but in a strictly military sense, you cannot think a strategy to work simply because you throw money at it, right? It doesn't work like that. It never works, per se, right? You can have, yes, an overwhelming force at some point. You can have, again, throwing other forms of resources, throwing men just at the enemy. That's not going to work just per se, right? And all the great successful armies, but also really the functional average is effective, right? The other delusion that spreads together with, again, the myth of the butchers, the myth of war is made by a few people, all the others pay for it because they have nothing to do with the responsibility of it. Nobody explains really why, because of course there is not an explanation. It's just, a mental disturbance. The sense that look, those guys were stupid. They lost the war because they sort of they had to lose the war in the first place, or because they were not rich enough, or whatever. That's not really how things notoriously go in war. You cannot reduce it to that. And so it's not just about money. Not even just a reason, of course, why wars are fought. Right? You can't quantify the gains that you can obtain politically in a war with money. So at that point, like, everything is money, right? What do we get money for? We get money for fulfilling our dreams, basically, to get stuff, but also to live in a certain way. So no, you can switch the thing every time you like, and it's not going to mean anything, right? In itself. So in the let's say in the role of administrators of the treasury of war, you find in the various states of 17th, 18th century Europe also very skilled people, very brilliant economists, financiers, that of course know their job, know especially where to find the funds, and that are exactly because of this entrusted with the management of taxes, and especially their collection. So at the advantage at that point of the state, as far as the military supplies really needed. This is a crucial point to understand. This had always been the case, right? It's just like we were saying before when we look at the cities in the Middle Ages, and you realize that they were, for monarchs, so those who were in charge, very powerful tools to curb the nobility. You see, at least to balance their power out, you see that you can co-opt the city elites to monopolize ever more the city supplies, so to have the steady flow of resources for royal armies, for example. Right? We'll pass also to the Judenhass, for example. Why also so much anti-Semitism developed in Europe historically from the side of the nobilistic, ethnicistic side of the story, because they were actually jealous of what the monarchs were accomplishing, thanks to to the Jews, in the sense that they were the only ones that were allowed to let's say to handle money in a certain way by law. Then eventually at this point really everybody in Christendom used handled money in the same way, but say the Jews were still some partly segregated and discriminated against minority that depended ever more on the truest elites, the highest ones, monarchs, kings, say emperors, and they were more trusted because they could not be part of the Christian establishment, and so the majority one that really was the force mostly complaining against the monarchic concentration of power, but also ending up being co-opted, as you know, in the state building process as such. So it's a complex path, but the idea is that we have seen also recently, talking about the development, for example, of the Habsburgic or the Prussian army in the 18th century, is that, of course, the state is born in Europe during this centuries largely through the process of avocation of certain prerogatives that were sold in exchange for the avoidal of soldiers billeting among the local communities. In other words, communities were willing to pay more to pay for proper barracks where soldiers could be housed and maintained by the state in exchange for them getting out of the way, because by the end of the Middle Ages, but still in the mid-17th century, most soldiers were just billeted across the country. Think about the French dragonnades against the Protestant, the Huguenots. Think about how late in time the militia systems were the levies were fully ousted from the say, the statal armies, right? Just for the sake of functionality, right? That's the moment in which the state really becomes absolute with the Code Napoleon, and you have the full capacity of the state to essentially have a unitary army with certain, of course, qualitative standards that also included the way these troops were supplied and paid, right? And also the structures, the means for them, for example, after the war, for welfare and so on. So it's a very gradual passage. But the idea is that those guys, especially when there is not yet a full bureaucracy formed, that the guys that can find resources more quickly for the military are also the guys that are in charge of the tax collection, because they know how they can find just the troops, right, and the resources to pay them, to equip them. And so during the 17th, the 18th century, start having properly economists, right, scientists of economy proper, or economics proper, that are entrusted with this most delicate task. Of course, they were not really the physical enforcers of that. They had their own thugs that press-ganged, as you know, records into this company. And of course, it was just considering, again, the fact that these people were the scum of the earth. Also kind of funny to do, let's be honest. But there were also dramatic stories behind that. And these were not really words where justice worked exactly in the way it works today, because the state was weaker. And so you could have this kind of violence enforced even by the same rulers in ways that were still very private looking. Right? And this happens everywhere, all across the board. I mean, from Prussia to the United Provinces, from France to England. And during the last period of Louis XIV's reign, the funds destined to fuel the various parts of the army passed all through, and this is interesting for the most Catholic king of Europe, through the Calvinist Geneva, right? That had been, especially the Swiss had evolved, right? They, fortunately for the Swiss, they were defeated at Marignano, because if it hadn't been so, they would have had to come out of permanently Switzerland, like controlling Milan or something. Instead, they were reduced, after all, to their isolated reality that was also strategically very well defendable, and funds start to be accumulated there. And the French would take money in part through this system, and there were all the various interests at stake for the outcome of the war, for how the way all these banks were involved in international, say, on the market, international economy, and so on. And at the beginning of the 18th century, you see governments and private bankers finding convenient to locate their money at interest rate in, again, the United Provinces and in England, while the Jewish financiers of the German principalities of the same period, so we're talking about famous families like the Behrens, the Lehmann, the Oppenheimer, were ever more committed in subcontracting the war expenses of their own lords. Right? This is quite fascinating because, first of all, you realize that you see here that the United Provinces and Great Britain are essentially becoming the true richest countries, right? As they still are today. I mean, when you look at the map of Europe, you know that the UK, the Netherlands, those are very rich countries. They're as rich, like to the same scale, more or less, of, you can see, Switzerland, etc. Other countries, Norway is also like that. Other countries, as we think, even very Western, also France is very rich, but I don't know, Sweden or Germany, at that point, are not extremely wealthy, in a sense. This young, ferocious, violent Protestant nations are very aggressive, very unprejudiced, and they really achieve a lot, as you know, both, mostly abroad, but also in the continent balance. And so, as such, they accumulate an enormous amount of wealth. I mean, You gotta admire the Dutch and the English to a degree that is difficult to do in the history of mankind. Otherwise, for being people, especially the Dutch, like that were really not coming from any progressed wealth or political compaction, whatever, but that succeeded. By the way, just having literally the greatest power, the hegemonic one in Europe next door, and being even repeatedly invaded by that. I'm talking France, of course. Aside from the wars between the Dutch and the English, by the way, that are at sea, that are a hell of a thing, as you know, managed to accumulate this traumatically disproportionate amount of wealth, right? That our countries in Europe really didn't, in spite of their being bigger countries, also later on, after they were unified, whatever. And this passes through that's the concept I was talking to you about before. I mean, the struggles between these states to emerge were such that, of course, were the Netherlands a rich country ever? Like, you can argue that they succeeded because they were rich. The opposite is true, right? They were some of the most depressed areas in Europe. The same goes for Switzerland. It was just said. I mean, they didn't have much of a military expansionistic success after all, but still they succeeded in becoming the overwhelmingly richest people in the world, simply by operating in this fashion and without literally having nothing, because there is literally nothing in Switzerland. I mean, zero in terms of resources, and this yet happens. So it's evidently not about money. It is not. Right. Also, England is fundamentally up to the 17th century, mid-17th century. It's pretty backwards as a country. After the 100 Years' War, they bailed out of Europe. Fundamentally, they didn't really develop that much. I mean, just at sea, eventually from Elizabethan times. But it's not until Cromwell that really England makes that step in terms of even having an adequate military instrument to pursue literally a continental policy of some sort. And yet, say, the British Empire has to take off, as you know, which would happen most at the beginning of the 18th century. But this must be forcefully recognized. I mean, you can't appreciate how successful these countries were historically until you understand, in fact, that the situation they came from. But it was an advantage, right? A bit like, I don't know, Sweden, that became an empire, even though, again, they had been pretty backwards, but paradoxically was that primitiveness that sort of helped sort of building up from scratch, right? It's like, when you think about the poorest countries, but not being, I mean, talking about today's times, not having great technology, but say, given that they get ex novo, they sort of update immediately to the highest, right? And it's not always an advantage, by the way. But in the case of Sweden, at least at the time, aside from their iron exports, as you know, it was French money that actually made Swedish power in the first place. So hence, a way money can be used to back others, also for whichever strategic reasons. In that case, oddly enough, the say Protestant Sweden being thrown at the Habsburgs from another eminently, of course, Catholic power like France, so surpassing that era of confessional clashes in this quite unprejudiced policy abroad. And about the Jews that we were talking about, in Central Europe there were lots of Jews, especially in countries like Germany, Poland, obviously before the Holocaust. From the Middle Ages, there had been the seeds of the largest communities. As we were talking about before, the other days about princely Germany, Germany still at this point largely is a hyper-fragmented area that suffers a lot. I mean, the 30 Years' War with armies crossing it, destroying, wiping out 1/3 of the population, actually being the most painful realization of that weakness. But also being very, witnessing the development of much more sort of in the smaller scale competitive systems at a local level. As we said, the Jews were obliged to carry out that certain specific. It's not true that say all of them were into this, of course, not even the majority, nor that, of course, there wasn't Christian banking. I mean, the papacy had regularized that. Basically, the interest rate was just accepted as sort of compensation for the maintenance of the money in the bank. Right, that's how Christianity had bypassed the thing. As we've seen here, the Calvinist Geneva, some of the single most puritanically minded communities, of course, of Christianity, were perfectly fine in handling an overwhelming amount of money without any problem. But in Germany, that was again the bit sort of the sleeping beauty, still living in a very feudal system for the time being. The Jews had maintained that sort of traditional role. Think about the Hofjude in Vienna. We talked about this because it's extremely crucial for the founding of the 1683 defense of Vienna. Right, these were very reliable, highly competent, and scrupulous state officials, and the Hofjude was properly recognized institutionally by the Habsburgs as the guy that at court has to do with that specific role, can handle more money. Ultra Catholic context in which, of course, the Jews were still were blamed directly, but that instrumentally were functional, of course, to the Habsburgic needs, and hence all those contradictions that, as you know, in Central European culture would bring literally to that true hatred. I mean, there's a radical divide in the European Jewry between Central Eastern Europe, where there are atrocious levels of anti-Semitism, massacres, pogroms, all the stuff throughout their entire history there, and countries like the Netherlands or Italy, where the Jews had always been integrated. They were discriminated against, they were ghettoed, but they also lived into the actual society. They were allowed to do so. Instead, in countries like Germany, like Poland, etc., they were literally outcasts. There were enormous communities of Jews that were literally pushed to the most complete moral and material misery. Hence also the negative stereotyping and hatred and sort of anti, let's say, as we were saying before, the nobility actually blaming the monarchy for being unpatriotic and national to allow these communities of alienated to remain as large parts of the population. But this, in fact, in the case of Germany, actually, this is not to say that these families were of this kind. The Behrens, the Lehmann, the Oppenheimer, that they were all, rich, respected people. But of course, in the world of the time, remember that it was completely the norm to think that Jews would simply go to hell on a point, right? And so they could do some of the stuff, and there was always something shady about it, and that's so much of what anti-Semitic theory, aside from all the mythology, the differences between the testaments, etc., have to do it. One day we can discuss that as well. I'm very open about the topic, but it's also about realizing the importance of these people in a very positive sense, meaning that again, fort estaters, as always. I mean, during the Middle Ages, bishops massacred the fort estaters that wanted to kill Jews to steal their money. Why? Because bishops, counts, etc., were true Christian aristocrats, and they knew, as in the imperial Catholic tradition, that the Jews had to leave with Christians till the end time, because they had to be the witness of the only religion really was tolerated behind Christianity, because they had to witness the fact that they were wrong. Essentially, it was their task, and hence nobody could really touch the Jews. Right? Bishops, noblemen were intelligent people. They ruled the system, and in times of crisis, in strange sort of fanaticism of the crowds, when Jews were attacked, they protected them. They brought them in their own castles. They made baths of blood, of course, of the lesser people. The one that, of course, tradition is very clear about this, right? If anybody thinks that somebody is less than the other, why do these people have more power than you, right? The entire conspiracy theory against the Jews is, according to the truest imperial Catholic tradition of Indo-European origin and more. It's actually what the Jews believe themselves. But okay, let's not digress in this mythological stuff. But it means that you're less than them. So the entire conspiracy theory against the Jews basically means that, if you think that, like Hitler, that they're an inferior race, that you're inferior to them. So decide yourself about that. And of course, actually, these were very successful people because they were very capable. And they had also gone through, of course, dynamics that had been even more challenging. The financial obligation system was really wide. It had catching a very broad net, and there were lots of course, associations based on shared interest, which procured at times the level of speculation, of course, really at a very wide level. It interests the same courts. This really had been the case from the Middle Ages. Think about all the Lombard bankers in England, how they literally settled in London just in large numbers that were co-opted in part when they say monarchy. It was all about being, for monarchies being always in need of money in a way, and so these guys were often subcontracted with actual assets, strategic ones, for the kingdom, mines. This was the case for the Fugger, for example, in southern Germany. That was a way, just okay, I make you handle, say, a cave, some place where we can extract precious resources, and as such, this is my contribution to, how I actually solve my debt with you, because very often the states were not able to pay back. They contracted a monstrous amount of debt. If you look at the reign of Louis XIV, with all these wars, really, the country was about to collapse from a moment to another on multiple occasions, and we're talking about enormous amount of wealth. So in many ways, just the guys who could handle these loans, etc., were often requiring something in exchange that was essentially a real asset form of settlement, for which, even if they lost, right, there are the first financial storms. Think about the Tulipan crisis in Holland, the first big market breakdown, right, real falls crisis. At least you can restart. War, let's remember, is still very poor, right? Of course, growth rate is really increasing, but especially before the Industrial Revolution, we're still talking about, after all, a very poor world in itself, and then being, especially for the expansion in other continents, the resources would have been still always limited, and many of them just were reabsorbed because everybody was getting resources in other ways. Anyway, it was a general growth, a general expansion. That's why these financial systems were ever more extended, also in depth in the local societies. There is need to fight, which again should not be confused with the so-called humanization of war. That is to say, war is always human. It doesn't become so from the second half of the 17th century up to the French Revolution and beyond, because those times were just witnessing an enormous expansion of the system, and of course everybody was competing for control. It was not about speculations that triggered wars as such, unless of course they caused some political consequences that brought war to be necessary in that regard. But war could be so profitable only because it was being fought for other reasons that are all one with a broader, again, sense, yes, of gain, but that ask a defeated country or one that just has become that poor on the brink of collapse, or in fact with a revolution, what is actually that war was worked in a way. You couldn't really predict it before. You could support the state in doing that, and given that you were sort of obliged, even as a subject, you even if you were an outside investor, let's say, this was because you had something at stake in it. You believed at least that war could be more or less profitable for that reason, but you also had to consider, to evaluate what was the political and strategical capacity of that country. So just participating to that is not, it is fueling war, but it's not the cause why that war is going to be fought in the first place. Surely there were single individuals who profited dramatically from wars, and especially the frequent and continuous ones that actually start seeing in the 18th century truly achieve a global dimension of conflict. But also regularly limited to some point, right? Wars couldn't be waged forever. They brought again to enormous indebtedness. This could not be hidden. Some of the greatest world assets, think about after the 7 Years' War, were essentially established with particular consequences. Think about for France, the indebtedness, also with the support of the American war of independence and so on, to eventually it was always a gamble, you see. So whether you make war, it's a gamble. If you don't make it, it's a gamble, because you're leaving the initiative to the enemy and what's going to happen. So again, what is there? Right? Do we have to blame people who didn't pay for war in the case somebody else profited from it, say because the system was not reformed enough and somebody had not made it, I don't know, look at France during the 7 Years' War, right? They failed, basically, almost on all fronts. And they were just a great power that would remain so, but, what if had been more efficient, right? There could have been an overseas French empire, probably something much bigger, considering the hegemonic role in continental Europe. But again, history went differently, and there, if you are British, for example, like, can you blame men of business for investing in a war against France? Of course not. Doesn't make any sense. So let's be honest and real about this. And consider that there is still, even in industrial times, of course, resources are not infinite. Like, even demographically speaking, you can't actually bring to fight everyone, really. The same territorial resources were suffering all of it. The replacement rate was still pretty modest for the time being, in spite of the Industrial Revolution and so on. So it's all something that very gradually and very difficultly happened. And so you understand that behind wars there were much greater motivations that had to do with the struggle for supremacy, basically, which is what everybody was doing to each other at the same time. So you had to really calibrate that. I mean, I will not talk today about how the early modern states managed their economy. It's a very complex topic. I will have to start some series about modern and contemporary history, at least starting from a manualistic base, then moving on. And this care was evident for every power, especially the smaller ones that, of course, were sort of more pressured and at some point even had smaller resources. Think about, Prussia, how it came to be in the first place, with a sort of paranoia that brought them on the offensive constantly, because they didn't have any other way to make it. If they had just sit there waiting their country to be, that feud was there to be destroyed. So it was a problem in so many different levels, including armed supplies from country to country, and watching over these investments was literally a guarantee of independence in some cases. There's a very interesting example I would like to read from you, from instruction of the government of Ragusa. I talked about medieval Ragusa on the Adriatic, on the Balkan coast, that is messaging to the Ragusan consul residing in Ancona, in central Italy, across the sea, and for a shipping of weapons and troops, dating June the 3rd, 1570. Right, this is close to Lepanto, just to make you understand which situation this was. The interland was Ottoman. Right, and let's read it. So this is the Ragusan government speaking to their consul in Ancona. To Messer Benedetto Mar Gondola in Ancona. The rector and the... I'm reading from... This is basically a translation from the Italian that they used. The rector and the councillors of Ragusa, together with the council of the Pregati, that were all the councils that worked in the city government. It's arrived here. The Sir Colonel Saporoso da Fermo. Fermo is a place in the Marches, close to Ancona. By the way, I made a video about medieval Ascoli if you're interested in a bit of Marquesan history. Yep. With letters of yours from the 23rd past. So this is basically May the 23rd. Wu, the colonel, was by us courteously received and will be treated with that love that is sought for. He has told us that he will thus write for the condotta, the hiring of 3 bombardieri would be gunners and a tambourine for the purchase of 200 arquebuses da posta, which I think means we're in 1570. Like at this point, guns were still fixed; they had a foresel, to stick on the ground for stability, and 6 drums. But you will provide the money for the purchase of such arquebuses and drums, and you will eventually get the money back from us here in Ragusa, basically. Equally, you will buy for us 500 ash pikes at the fair of Foligno, which is in Umbria in central Italy. This is interesting because the guys went sort of into the Apenninic hinterland rather than going somewhere else to get this stuff. We're in the Papal States. This is important. Warning to have, we warn that this stuff you buy has to be beautiful and good, right? And for the cost, you will be refunded, as we've said, and you will send us this stuff together with the ship Dolistovic. All right, remember, it's an Italian-Slavic context in Ragusa, right? Practically, and in order to essentially extract freely this, I think this is referring to the money, you will write to Rome to Messer Francesco Gondola that will procure to obtain the license by our Lord, and that will from our Lord, and that will send it to us as soon as it can, so that it will. This is actually for the stuff, where it has to be sent as quickly as possible to Ragusa, the weapons, so that not even an hour will be lost for the provision of the aforementioned things. Besides the license for the extraction of weapons, you will write to Gondola in order to for him to grant us, from his beatitude, if possible, a patent in which he will render known that how he will send across the Adriatic these weapons, and that he will command, under the pain of excommunication, that any Christian power won't stop these weapons. This is important because here the guy was basically issued to make clear that this weapons was legal, because again, this was at the height of the wars between the Ottomans and the Christians in the Mediterranean, so there was a lot of smuggling of weapons. It was full of pirates, the Balkan coast and all this stuff, and so the idea is that if this cargo had been intercepted by some Christian power, you could show this patent and say, well, this is officially stuff that we have to send to Ragusa, it's all legal, right? Do not confiscate that. And in sending the ship, you will command to the master of the ship that he will keep his navigation along the coast of Abruzzo and of Puglia, so that you will be able to come here more easily, right? So in other words, they will advising them to go down the Italian coast south of Ancona before veering towards Ragusa on the other side of the Adriatic, because evidently the northern route was more dangerous had they crossed at that point. And the patent we discussed above, you will give to the master of the ship, so that if he will need it along his journey, he will make use of that, right? This is interesting because, of course, other kind of ships were involved, like not just governmental ones necessarily. So he would have this discretion to which kind of, you will see it better, ship he would want to send the stuff. In fact, the final note says, if you decide to send such weapons with some such arms with some pedottina, I think it's a type of smaller vessel, from Ancona, or some other ship that you will boat that you would judge better than the ship, we will actually it's okay for you to do so, and especially warn that boat or other type of vessel where you will load the arms, again, to keep the navigation along the coast of Abruzzo and Puglia, as it was said, once you will have the pikes, he says. If by that point you will not have had the arquebuses, or you will not be able to have those so quickly, as we've seen, it's possible. So the pikes were more important than the arquebuses, interestingly enough. We will accept, like, essentially your arrangement. You will send the pikes first, and maybe the arquebuses later with another ship, right? This is extremely fascinating because it shows the means through which, you see, that the important is the weapons, right? The cost coverage is something secondary. Is what we were saying before. The government had the money, but what they needed was arms, because evidently there was a specific purpose there, and as quickly as possible. And pikes, not even arquebuses, which of course you would think they would be more in need of at this point. Yes, pikes are actually still more prevalent and in this sense important than arquebuses. But it's not that arquebuses were just so irrelevant. Actually, at this point, the mix was pretty well balanced, to say the least. When I say more important than the arquebuses, actually we mean, of course, as an arm, right? Missile and sort of melee. And here, the fact that pikes are missing is again fascinating, or at least that are more needed is also fascinating. And they have to be of the ash type, and the guy asks for buying this in central Italy, in Umbria, in the Papal State. So it's not even that they're connected to a specific political governmental channel. They just buy them in Italy on their own. And this is fascinating as well, because it's still, again, in 1570, it's all very pre-industrial, definitely, as a system. even in places like this that were quite affluent. I mean, we've seen it that the history of ragus also for the Middle Ages, it's an important one. But you understand also the dependence on other countries, the logistical issues. You have to send people, you have to pay them, you have to get the money back from somewhere. You have these referees basically that you can count on, as the consul in Ancona, that, as you know, was yet another important republic, a maritime republic back in the day, a hell of a port. So it all adds up. I thought it was just an interesting example to point out how also this obsession will just go down towards Abruzzo and Apulia, because you may have problems. Basically, they don't even say why, because they already knew why there could be problems further north. These are fascinating things. The fact that we can read these sources written by the same guys at the time. It's not that even a long time ago, but just think about what the word really was at the time, and how different really it was compared to our own. These are the things that when you study history will blow your mind. And just, I don't want to disappoint you, because I make lots of videos about these topics, especially about modern warfare. I realize I have a pretty large playlist, but it always feels, of course, compared to the medieval ones, that I do things a bit less in depth. Of course, I cannot sell you, I don't know, an hour and a half long video about just finance in early medieval Europe, early modern Europe, for for armies, military funding, etc. Just like this, right? Too many that this is already a very long video. Well, yeah, okay, but the topic is so big, we aren't even beginning. Of course, we will make other videos, but also at some point we will properly have to search sort of a deeper way to look at modern warfare, because again, I'm just a humble medievalist, but I realize the necessity of covering everything with the adequate detail and depth, and that's it. What else to say? You've seen, even just in a video like this, how many aspects we could touch, how many references, how many concepts. Mainly, again, the idea that if you are the richest, right? I met people who actually, I was about to marry one. Like, she told that as an archaeologist, that first she changed versions. No, she didn't want to appear strange to me, probably in a way, but first she said it's all about technology. I said, well, it's not really about technology. I'm talking about war. It's about the riches. Well, it's not about the riches. I mean, you can't find any single it's always the populistic whining about it's the rich guys that rule the world, they're so terrible. Well, first of all, guys are richer because they have accomplished something in their lives, and you should ask the others why they haven't, first of all. And the idea that the other guys got rich before, means, where were you then, if you existed as you did? The other concept is, of course, it's full of wars by poorer contendants that won over richer ones. I mean, how many do we have to discuss here? Do we have to talk about the Dutch against the Spanish? Do we have to talk about the Swiss against the Burgundians? These are the very foundations of modern warfare. Like, if you start from that mentality, you wonder what kind of, where have you been in your life? That's under a rock somewhere. Like, how do you think the world works? It's very strange to me, because it's just winery, and it's not about even the historical ignorance. It's literally, it's evidently false. It's just another way you're basically complaining for no reason whatsoever about something that you know to be false. And so this just means that you want to lie and to say that, you want something in exchange for nothing, for something you didn't earn, you didn't deserve. Why don't you grow up? I think that's the best thing you can do. Anyhow, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.